It was a typical afternoon for Karen Whitmore. She sat by her front window, as she did every day, sipping iced tea and glancing at her phone every few minutes. She was watching, paying attention. Karen didn't think of herself as nosy, at least that's what she told herself. She just liked knowing what was going on in her neighborhood, who came and went, who belonged and who didn't. Then she saw him. A black man in a gray SUV slowly pulled into the driveway of a house 3 doors down on Johnson Place. The house had belonged to the Johnsons, but they'd moved out almost 6 months ago, and as far as Karen knew, no one had bought it. Karen leaned forward, her lips pursed as she saw the man get out of the car. He wasn't dressed like a delivery man, no uniform, no paper clips, just jeans, a navy sweater, and a casual jacket. He moved confidently, as if he had every right to be there. But Karen wasn't sure. She squinted as he opened the trunk, pulled out a few boxes, and carried them toward the front door. Her finger hovered over her phone. Who should she call? Maybe he was with the realtor, or a contractor working inside. But Karen hadn't seen a for sale sign in weeks. Then she saw something that startled her. The man didn't just set the boxes down, he pulled out a key and slid it into the lock, walking straight inside. Karen's heart sped up. Her thumb slid across the screen, scrolling through her recent calls. This isn't about race, she told herself. This is about safety. What if this man was sitting around? What if he was trying to break in? The neighborhood was quiet, and Karen wasn't about to let things get this far. So she dialed 9.1.1. The police arrived quickly. 2 patrol cars pulled up with their lights flashing. Karen watched from the window as they walked up to the man's door, knocked, and then, surprise flashed across their faces. Minutes later, another man showed up, a real estate agent, whom Karen recognized. Hours later, the news spread through the neighborhood, the man Karen had called the police to was the new owner of the house. And what left the neighborhood speechless wasn't Karen calling 9.1.1. It was the fact that the new owner, a renowned surgeon, had just moved in to start a new job at the city's largest hospital. When Karen heard that, she felt a wave of shame roll over her. That afternoon began like any other, but ended with a lesson the neighborhood would never forget. Karen sat in her chair, her hand clutching the phone, her eyes still fixed on the house across the street. She swallowed, trying to calm herself, but her fingers were already pressing 911. What is your emergency? Yes. I want to report a suspicious person, Karen gasped. A man just walked into a vacant house on my street. I don't think he's supposed to be there. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional. Can you describe the man? Karen hesitated. He's middle-aged, medium build, drives a gray SUV. He parked in the driveway and, he used a key to get in. There was a brief pause. So, he used a key? Yes, Karen said quickly, but the house has been vacant for months. I don't know if he has permission to be there. After asking for his name, location, and a few other details, the dispatcher said, "We'll have an officer check it out right away." Karen thanked him and hung up, sitting back with her arms crossed over her chest, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and anxiety. She wasn't accusing anyone, just making sure everything was okay. It was the good neighbor thing to do. A few minutes later, police sirens sounded in the distance. A patrol car pulled up behind the gray SUV. 2 officers got out, their hands near their waists. The man emerged from the house with a confused look on his face as the officers approached. Karen couldn't hear the conversation, but she saw his eyebrows raise, his hands raised as if explaining something. The officers gestured toward the car and the house. Karen leaned in, her heart pounding. Then she saw the man pull a pad of paper from his back pocket and hold it up. One officer took it, glanced at it, and nodded. Head. Instantly, their demeanor changed. The tension eased, and within a minute, everyone seemed to relax. Karen sat there, feeling uneasy. She began to wonder if she should make that call. The man stood still, his eyes on the door, gesturing slowly. One of the officers, who looked older, even gave him a brief nod before returning to the patrol car. No explanation, no arrest or questioning. Karen felt her heart beat faster, her throat dry. Something was seriously wrong. They didn't arrest him. They didn't even ask any more questions. Instead, they simply walked back to their car as if everything was settled, as if she had made a stupid mistake. But Karen knew, or at least felt, that this was just the beginning. Her fingers tightened around her iced tea, her eyes fixed on the scene before her. The officers turned their backs on the man, and he just stood there, as if everything was settled. But settled how? She couldn't stop thinking about it. Suddenly, unable to bear it any longer, Karen stood up. She opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch, pretending to check the mailbox. Close enough to hear the conversation, but far enough away to not draw attention. The man she thought had broken into the house stood still, arms crossed, occasionally shaking his head in the direction of the patrol car. One of the officers walked up to him, patting him on the shoulder before turning back to the driver. Karen couldn't help herself. She walked quickly across the lawn, waving to get the attention of one of the officers. The middle-aged man with short gray hair turned to look at her. "Ma'am." Karen tried to smile politely, but couldn't hide the worry in her voice. "What's going on?" "I'm the one who called. I saw this man come in and I was worried. The house has been empty for months." The officer glanced at the man before turning back to her, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, this is Mr. Ellington. He's the new owner. He just moved in today." Karen blinked, feeling a chill run down her spine. She looked at the man, who was standing just a few feet away, his face expressionless but something, a tired patience or a suppressed frustration. "Yes, I live here," his voice was calm but tinged with annoyance. Karen opened her mouth but couldn't form any words. She looked back and forth between the officers and the man, searching for a reasonable explanation. But when she looked back at the house, there was no moving truck, no sign of a new mover. And that's when Marcus, the man they called Ellington, let out a dry chuckle. Marcus stood still, his eyes following Karen's every move. The tension between them was thick, but he kept his voice even. "I recognized you from earlier today," he said, his voice lower. Karen frowned, taking a step back. "I don't understand what you mean." "You saw me enter my house," Marcus continued. "But you don't realize that I've seen you. Many times." Karen's throat was dry. She tried to keep her composure, but she couldn't hide the worry in her eyes. "What are you implying? You've been following me, haven't you?" Marcus tilted his head, his sharp eyes never leaving hers. "No, she hesitated. I just wanted to make sure everything was safe. I'm protecting this neighborhood." "Everything's safe," Marcus said, his voice not losing its patience but not entirely softening either. "Until you called the police on me." Karen clenched her fists, feeling the weight of the officer's gaze, still standing nearby, watching their every reaction. She turned to Marcus, searching his expression for any sign of complacency. Instead, she saw only calm, mixed with something she couldn't quite place. "It was a misunderstanding," the officer said, breaking the silence. "But if you have any concerns, I'd suggest you talk to your neighbors before calling us." It felt like a warning. Karen took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She looked at Marcus one last time before turning away. But his voice pulled her back. "Have you ever wondered," he said, his voice quieter, "why I noticed you in the first place?" Karen stopped. She turned back to look at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you mean?" Marcus smiled slightly, but didn't answer. And in that look, she realized that she never really knew anything about the man standing in front of her. Karen stood still, her hand gripping the doorknob as the image on Marcus's phone screen illuminated her face. She saw herself, walking past his house, over and over again. A chill ran down her spine. I was just taking a walk, she tried to keep her voice even. Marcus tilted his head, his smile still unfriendly. That many times? Always looking at my house. What a strange habit, Karen. She didn't answer. Her throat was dry. Her heart felt like it was about to burst out of her chest. I just want to understand, Marcus continued, his voice soft but sharp. Why do you care so much about me? I don't care about you, she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Marcus shrugged, but his eyes didn't leave her. Then I'm sure you wouldn't mind if I sent these videos to someone. Maybe the police. They'll be amused by the way you hang around my house. Karen felt like the world was closing in around her. What was she supposed to do? She couldn't let him. What do you want? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. Marcus smiled. This time, it was scarier than anything she'd imagined. We'll talk, he replied. About everything you know. Karen couldn't breathe. She knew this moment would come. She just hadn't expected it to come so soon. Karen stood still, her eyes glued to her driveway. Night had fallen, the streetlights dimly illuminating the swaying trees. She glanced toward the window, feeling a sudden chill run down her spine. Marcus's voice spoke in the darkness, quiet but powerful. You called the cops on me, he tilted his head, his eyes never leaving hers, but I had days of videotaping you, stalking around my house before I moved in. Karen's throat tightened, her breathing coming in short gasps. A sudden heat rose to her face. I was just taking a normal walk, she said, her voice shaking. Marcus sighed, shaking his head slowly. Yeah, because most people take normal walks, past the same house, at the same time, every day. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. She saw Marcus's eyes studying her carefully before he put his phone in his pocket. At first I wasn't sure what your deal was, Marcus continued, his voice even but sharp. But then I watched my footage. I saw the way you kept looking at the house, like you were waiting for something. Karen's heart pounded, his words sounding ridiculous, but she couldn't deny them completely. Marcus walked slowly toward her, each step lengthening the tension. Maybe, but look. I did some digging, found out this house has been vacant for months. But somehow, everyone around here knows it's been talked about. Karen's lips twitched, but Marcus didn't let her speak. The funny thing is, he continued, his eyes locked on hers, I was the only one who made an offer on this house. There was no one else, no counterbidder, just me. And then my realtor said, there's been talk in the neighborhood. Some people are expecting someone to move in. Karen felt her breath catch. Marcus's words weighed heavily on her. What I want to know, Marcus nodded slightly, his eyes never leaving hers, is exactly, who are you waiting for? The silence stretched between them. Karen could feel the weight of Marcus's words. She wanted to deny it all, to say it was all a misunderstanding. But she knew, somehow, that Marcus was no longer guessing. And if he knew this, what else did he know? Karen slammed the door shut, her breath coming in short gasps. When Marcus turned to leave, her hands were shaking. She dashed into the kitchen, where the yellow light did nothing to dispel the feeling of dread that surrounded her. Karen held the edge of the counter, breathing deeply in and out. No, this couldn't be happening. He couldn't possibly have anything incriminating about her. He was just trying to freak her out. But deep down, she knew better. Marcus had found evidence. Evidence that she'd been watching his house for days. Evidence of the anonymous calls to the police to check on the house without a valid reason. And worse, Marcus had discovered what no one was allowed to talk about, that this house wasn't for him. She'd heard the whispers. Judy, the community board woman, had hinted at a recent meeting that they were keeping an eye on who bought a house in the neighborhood. Not in an aggressive way, just a concern for aesthetics and culture. When the Johnson house had been for sale, it was understood that the new owners would have to conform to the neighborhood standards. But then Marcus bought it. And just like that, everything changed. Karen picked up her phone and opened the neighborhood chat. She hesitated. Should she text now, warn Judy or someone? But that would be too obvious. She needed to do something, because Marcus wouldn't let this go. That afternoon, the news spread quickly. Linda, Karen's neighbor, was the first to report it. There was a soft, hesitant knock on the door. When Karen opened it, Linda stood there, holding her phone as if it had betrayed her. "Did you see this?" Linda asked, her voice a whisper. Karen frowned. "See what?" Linda hesitated, then turned the phone screen around. Karen felt her heart sink. It was a video Marcus had posted. Security cameras had recorded Karen walking past his house for days, stopping every now and then to glance inside. The timestamps on the video made it all indisputable. But the worst part was the end. Marcus appears, looking straight into the camera. "This is what I saw before I moved in," he says, his tone sharp and meaningful. "The moment I walked into my house, the tension was palpable. I had just moved in, hoping for a fresh start. But then the police showed up. I wasn't trespassing, I wasn't breaking in. I was just a black man walking into a house that I owned." The video cut to Karen, her hands clenched, her face hard. "Where did he post this?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "On Facebook, Instagram, and the neighborhood group," Linda replied, her voice almost cracking. "Karen, what is this?" Karen exhaled sharply. "It was taken out of context," she tried to defend. Linda looked at her, her eyes full of disappointment. "He's not suspicious. He's just moving into my house. But I'm protecting the neighborhood." Karen tried to maintain her composure. "If I see someone suspicious, I have the right to call the police." Linda pursed her lips. "But he's not suspicious, Karen." There was silence, then Linda continued, her voice faltering. "Everyone's talking. Judy's commented. She's trying to do damage control, but this isn't going away." Karen felt her chest tighten, her face burning with shame. Marcus, the man she suspected, had exposed everything. Not just her actions, but her reasons for doing them. And now, everyone knew. The next few days were a nightmare. Karen barely left the house. The humiliation was greater than when her youngest son dropped out of college, greater than when her husband left her for a woman 20 years younger, greater than when she was punished for leaving Christmas decorations up until February. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just about her, it was about how others saw her. The first sign came at the grocery store. She left early, hoping to avoid prying eyes. But even in the most deserted alleys, she felt them. The furtive glances, the hurried whispers. And then, she turned a corner, almost bumping into a woman she knew. She stopped, her eyes sweeping over Karen with an expression she had never seen before, disappointment mixed with contempt. "The moment I walked into my house, the tension was palpable. I had just moved in, hoping for a fresh start. But then the police showed up. I wasn't trespassing, I wasn't breaking in. I was just a black man walking into a house that I owned." The video cut to Karen, her hands clenched, her face hard. "Where did he post this?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "On Facebook, Instagram, and the neighborhood group," Linda replied, her voice almost cracking. "Karen, what is this?" Karen exhaled sharply. "It was taken out of context," she tried to defend. Linda looked at her, her eyes full of disappointment. "He's not suspicious. He's just moving into my house. But I'm protecting the neighborhood." Karen tried to maintain her composure. If I see someone suspicious, I have the right to call the police. Linda pursed her lips. But he's not suspicious, Karen. There was silence, then Linda continued, her voice faltering. Everyone's talking. Judy's commented. She's trying to do damage control, but this isn't going away. Karen felt her chest tighten, her face burning with shame. Marcus, the man she suspected, had exposed everything. Not just her actions, but her reasons for doing them. And now, everyone knew. The next few days were a nightmare. Karen barely left the house. The humiliation was greater than when her youngest son dropped out of college, greater than when her husband left her for a woman 20 years younger, greater than when she was punished for leaving Christmas decorations up until February. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just about her, it was about how others saw her. The first sign came at the grocery store. She left early, hoping to avoid prying eyes. But even in the most deserted alleys, she felt them. The furtive glances, the hurried whispers. And then, she turned a corner, almost bumping into a woman she knew. She stopped, her eyes sweeping over Karen with an expression she had never seen before, disappointment mixed with contempt. Bethany Moore stood still on the sidewalk, her eyes following Karen's stroller as it slowly rolled along. Bethany's face was tense, but she managed a polite smile. "Oh. Hey Karen," Bethany said, her voice a little low. "Hey," Karen replied, her fingers tightening on the stroller handle. She paused, waiting for Bethany to say something more. A greeting, a small talk, like Bethany always did. But this time, there was a long, heavy silence. After a brief pause, Bethany just nodded and walked away. Karen stood there, her jaw clenched. Without anyone saying it, she knew she had been removed, unofficially, but clearly. In the neighborhood chat group, her messages stopped getting responses. No one liked her posts, no one answered her questions. The conversation continued as if she no longer existed. At the HOA meeting, Karen almost decided not to attend. But to ignore it, would be an admission of defeat. So she sat up straight in her usual chair, her hands folded in her lap as Judy stood at the podium, reading the latest information about the neighborhood. When it came to the open discussion, Marcus stood up. Karen felt her stomach drop. "Since I'm new here," Marcus began, his voice calm, "I just want to make sure I understand how things work." Judy flashed a bright smile. "Of course, we always want to keep lines of communication open." "Good," Marcus nodded, "because I'm curious, how does the HOA handle a situation where a homeowner is harassed, before they even move in?" Karen's fingers tightened in her palm. Judy paused, her smile stiff. I'm not sure I understand what you mean." Marcus nodded, pulling out his phone. "I think you do," he said, tapping the screen. A video began playing, the one he'd posted online. Murmurs spread quickly around the room, someone cleared their throat, a few people fidgeted. When Marcus put the phone away, he asked, "So what's the policy on this?" Judy cleared her throat, her eyes darting to Karen. I think we should discuss this, in private." Marcus smiled. "Oh." Karen stood in the kitchen, her hands shaking as she set her glass of water down on the counter. The whispers from the living room continued to echo, each word like a knife cutting through the air. She knew all eyes were on her, but she still felt the weight of judgment. Marcus stood in the middle of the room, his voice calm but sharp. "I didn't come here to shame anyone. I came here to show people the truth, and to show people themselves." No one said anything, but Karen could feel them retreating, inch by inch, as if the distance would protect them from involvement. And then she realized, she was completely alone. Karen had always believed she belonged to this community. She had spent years cultivating an image of being a model citizen, attending every HOA meeting, organizing events, keeping the house immaculate. She never thought it would all come crashing down. But it had come, and it was worse than she could have imagined. A week later, when the phone rang, Karen picked it up and heard Andrew, her son, on the other end. "What did you do?" His voice was tense and angry. "What are you talking about? Don't you know? I got a call from a coworker today, they saw your video. The whole office knows. My boss knows." Karen's heart sank. "I didn't think it was that big of a deal, but you know exactly what you did, right?" Andrew interrupted. Karen tried to explain, but every word seemed hollow. She had never imagined the consequences would be so dire. And for the first time, she understood that some mistakes were irreparable, and the price was complete isolation. Karen sat in the foyer, quietly twisting the ring on her finger, while the whispers around her became impossible to ignore. They were talking about her mother, and the way they described her, as if she were a racist caricature, made Karen's throat tighten. "Thanks, Andrew," she thought bitterly. "Just don't call me for a while, okay?" The line was dead. Karen stared at the phone in her hand, a hollow feeling sinking in her chest. It was the first time she'd felt anything close to shame. When the HOA meeting minutes were released, her name had disappeared entirely. Not a mention, not an invitation to any upcoming events. It wasn't a formal removal, but it didn't need to be. She was being slowly, mercilessly eliminated. Neighbors who had once waved happily now looked right through her, as if she had never existed. Conversations she had been a part of were now happening without her. And then came the final blow. Her property values. Karen had spent years building the neighborhood's reputation, ensuring that homes were sold only to the right people. But now Marcus had launched an outreach initiative. Local media hailed him as a symbol of resilience, fighting exclusionary practices. Outside attention poured in, questions began to surface about how the HOA had handled past home sales. And suddenly, the community that had prided itself on its reputation was under intense scrutiny. Homes weren't selling as quickly as they used to. Karen had fought to keep things the same, but all she'd accomplished was ensure that things would change, and not go back. One evening, she sat alone on her front porch, her eyes on the house she'd worked so hard to protect. Trying to keep herself empty. Across the street, Marcus was laughing with his sister as they carried groceries into the house. He glanced at Karen, and for a moment, their eyes met. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. Just a slow nod, not out of kindness, but out of recognition. Karen looked away first. She was lost. And deep down, she knew she deserved it. Prejudice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's hidden behind concern. Behind tradition. Behind what's supposed to be best for the neighborhood. But the truth always comes out. Let this be a reminder that your actions shape how the world sees you, and sometimes, the person who gets exposed isn't the person you expect. If you believe stories like this need to be heard, be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and let's keep these conversations going.